In the frigid spring of 1941, the North Atlantic had already earned its reputation as one of the most unforgiving battlegrounds of the Second World War. But beyond the wolf packs and the endless reach of German reconnaissance aircraft, Allied sailors feared something far more fundamental: the fog. Dense, rolling banks of vapor that moved silently across the convoy routes had swallowed ships whole long before the U-boats ever took their toll. And on the night of March 15th, 1941, during the voyage of Convoy HX-112, fog would become the catalyst for one of the most unnerving maritime episodes of the early Atlantic campaign. HX-112 was a mixed convoy, 28 merchant vessels sailing from Halifax to Liverpool, escorted by a small but experienced screen composed of Royal Navy and Royal Canadian Navy destroyers and corvettes. Their mission was simple: deliver vital fuel, grain, and industrial supplies to Britain at a moment when the island nation was dangerously low on resources. But as the convoy pushed eastward, the weather grew unstable. Barometric pressure dropped rapidly, and a heavy, wet fog began forming over the Grand Banks. By dusk it had thickened into a gray wall, swallowing horizon, sea, and sky until the convoy's meticulously spaced columns vanished from each other's view. Commander A. Tate of HMS Walker, leading the escort group, later described the fog as a curtain drawn by an indifferent god, so dense that even a ship's own bow seemed to fade into it. Visibility fell to less than 50 yards. Wireless silence was maintained to avoid detection, but within the void the lack of communication became a silent threat. Several merchant captains reduced speed, afraid of collision. Others attempted to hold course by dead reckoning alone, hoping their calculations would keep them aligned with the convoy's plotted track. But somewhere between 2,100 and 2,300 hours, three ships, the British tanker Belcrest, the freighter Convoys, and the Norwegian vessel Eli Knudsen, simply vanished from the formation. At first, no alarm was raised. Such temporary disappearances were not entirely uncommon during thick weather, and escorts were already stretched thin scanning for U-boat contacts. The Kriegsmarine had stepped up Wolfpack operations that month, and HX-112's escort group had intercepted several radio transmissions hinting that U-boat ace Otto Kretschmer and his Type WWII submarine, U-99, lurked somewhere in the region. Yet by early morning, when the fog briefly lifted, the missing ships had still not reappeared. Their plotted positions showed a deceptively simple truth: all three should have been within 2 miles of the convoy center column. But the sea around HX-112 was empty. The struggle to maintain awareness in such conditions tested even the most veteran officers. Quartermasters strained to hold steady courses using only compasses and the subtle feel of the swells. Lookouts leaned over rails, staring into a shifting wall of white. Every few minutes, distant foghorns echoed across the water, sometimes from known ships, sometimes from no identifiable source. Engineer James Morley of the Convoys would later write in his diary that the world existed only as sound waves slapping steel and voices swallowed by mist. When the sun finally broke through late that morning, HS Vanek led a search pattern west of the convoy's track. At 1,045 hours, they located one of the missing vessels, the Belcrest. But it was over 14 nautical miles off course, drifting in near silence. Its crew reported that the ship's compass had behaved erratically during the night and that they had altered course after hearing what they believed were the propellers of an approaching submarine. No such vessel was detected. The second vessel, the Convoys, was found 2 hours later in a position equally out of alignment. Its captain claimed the fog had caused visual distortions, making nearby ships appear farther than they were. This account puzzled the escort officers. No optical illusion could explain such an extreme navigation error. Diaries from the Convoys crew recorded moments where the fog shimmered, as if backlit, though no source of light was ever identified. But the Eli Knudsen remained missing. For nearly 36 hours, escort vessels ran sonar sweeps while aircraft from Iceland attempted visual searches. On March 17th, wreckage was recovered: oil drums, splintered timber, and sections of lifeboat. Naval intelligence concluded the ship may have been torpedoed during the night, possibly by Kretschmer himself. Yet no U-boat later claimed the kill, and German records captured after the war contained no reference to the attack. The disappearance of the Eli Knudsen entered convoy lore not because of dramatic combat, but because of its eerie, contextless nature. A ship lost without distress call, gunfire, or survivors, all during a night where the fog seemed to smother not just visibility, but understanding. Modern maritime historians still debate the incident. Some blame navigational drift. Others suspect collision. Some point to the fog's known ability to distort sound, causing ships to alter course unnecessarily. But the official conclusion of the Admiralty remains unchanged. Loss attributed to enemy action, circumstances unknown. And those final two words, circumstances unknown, set the tone for the mysteries that would follow in the convoys ahead. For in the North Atlantic of World War II, disappearance was not always the result of enemy fire. Sometimes it came simply from the sea and the fog that cloaked it. By the spring of 1942, the Arctic convoys had become some of the most perilous supply routes of the Second World War. These lifelines to the Soviet Union, laden with tanks, ammunition, food, and industrial equipment, braved a gauntlet of extreme weather and constant German attack. But among the dangers of the Barents Sea, one force held a uniquely unnerving reputation: the sudden, blinding Arctic fog. For the sailors of Convoy PQ-13, the fog was not just an inconvenience. It was a threat capable of unraveling an entire convoy in minutes. PQ-13 sailed from Iceland in late March 1942, heading into waters that British commanders privately referred to as the Corridor of Maybes, a stretch where weather, ice, and enemy forces shifted too rapidly for accurate forecasting. The convoy consisted of 19 merchant ships and a protective screen of Royal Navy destroyers, including HMS Offa, HMS Orby, and the aging but dependable HMS Fury. Their destination was Murmansk, one of the few northern Soviet ports still accessible in winter. Before departure, escort commander Captain Robert Sherbrooke warned his officers, "The Germans will not be our only enemy this voyage. The sea itself has a mind of its own up here." His prediction would prove chillingly accurate. On March 29th, nearing the edge of the Barents Sea, visibility dropped sharply. The temperature plummeted below -20 degrees Celsius, and a heavy bank of fog swept in from the west, blanketing the convoy in minutes. Ice clung to rigging, radar systems struggled, and even the brightest signal lamps were reduced to dim glows swallowed by the whiteness. Ships could barely see their neighbors' stern lights. The convoy began tightening formation, but the fog moved faster than the escorts could respond. By 0300 hours, PQ-13 had collapsed into scattered fragments. Merchant ships attempted to stay on course using compass headings alone, but the fog shifted their sense of distance and orientation. Some captains reduced speed, others maintained full steam to avoid drifting into ice fields. The result was chaos, silent, invisible, and potentially fatal. The destroyers fared little better. HMS Orby nearly collided with the freighter Ballet after miscalculating its bearing by nearly 30 degrees. A signalman aboard Orby later noted in his log, "The fog was alive. It rolled, curled, and swallowed us whole." Nearby, HMS Offa attempted to herd a group of Soviet-bound tankers back into formation, but within minutes they vanished into the vapor like ghosts. When dawn rose, though rose was generous, given the dim polar light, the convoy had fractured into small groups drifting across dozens of miles. That was when the danger intensified. German reconnaissance aircraft had tracked PQ-13 intermittently. Fog had interfered with Luftwaffe visibility too, but the scattered Allied ships were now isolated targets. Even worse, several German destroyers and U-boats operating from bases in Norway had been diverted to intercept. At 0930 hours, HMS Trinidad, one of the British cruisers supporting the convoy, picked up garbled distress signals. A merchant vessel, likely the Bateau, reported being shelled from the direction of the fog. Minutes later, another call warned of torpedo wakes barely visible beneath the ice-laced water. But determining which ships had sent the signals, or where they were, proved impossible. Hours passed before the fog finally thinned. As it lifted, HMS Fury and HMS Orby began regrouping the surviving ships. But several vessels were missing: the freighters Harpalion, Bateau, and Effingham Hall. Their last recorded positions did not match the tracks where the escorts expected them to be. German records captured after the war confirmed attacks around that time, yet inconsistencies plagued the accounts: timing mismatches, conflicting bearings, and unexplained gaps in naval patrol logs. One incident stood out. A Luftwaffe pilot's debriefing mentioned observing a lone merchant ship moving erratically through the fog, heading south when all Allied ships should have been moving northeast. Another report from a German destroyer commander claimed they shelled a vessel traveling at unusually low speed, as if drifting. No Allied logs matched this behavior. Even after comparing both Allied and German reports decades later, historians still struggle to determine exactly how or when those ships were lost. Fog can distort sound, bending it across the water in unpredictable ways. Echoes rebound strangely. Engines seem closer or farther than they truly are. Several Soviet sailors recalled hearing explosions during the fog, but could not judge direction or distance. The human factor weighed heavily too. Ice buildup could jam rudders. Low visibility caused ships to overcorrect their course. And radio silence, essential for avoiding detection, prevented captains from calling for aid until the very moment disaster struck. But the lingering mystery remains. Why did several ships end up so far off their expected tracks? Navigation errors alone struggle to account for such large deviations. Some historians suggest that in the disorienting fog, false sound bearings or drifting ice fields may have coaxed captains away from the convoy without them realizing it. Others believe incomplete German reports hide details of engagements they chose not to record. For the survivors of PQ-13, the memory of that fog never faded. It was not dramatic like a naval battle or devastating like an air raid. It was quiet, cold, absolute. A force that rendered men and ships insignificant before nature's unpredictable will. And as PQ-13 struggled to reform in the aftermath, the Allies would soon face another convoy where fog not only fractured formation, but triggered events still debated to this day. By the summer of 1943, the Allies were tightening their grip on the Atlantic, yet uncertainty still ruled the northern sea lanes. Radar had improved, escort groups were more experienced, and Allied codebreakers had made U-boat operations increasingly desperate. But even with these advantages, the stretch south of Greenland remained a place where convoy captains spoke with a level of respect bordering on superstition. Weather changed without warning. Icebergs drifted unpredictably, and the fog, cold, heavy, and blinding, could erase entire formations from view. It was in this environment that one of the war's most perplexing convoy incidents unfolded, involving a fast troop reinforcement group bound for Iceland. On the evening of July 7, 1943, Convoy TG-47, an unofficial designation used in escort logs, moved northeast in a tight formation. It consisted of several U.S. Army transports carrying replacement troops for the Iceland Base Command, escorted by a small but capable screen of U.S. Navy and Royal Navy destroyers, including USS Nicholson, USS DuPont, and HMS Wanderer. Their route had been chosen for its relative safety from U-boat patrols, but weather reports warned of a dense marine layer advancing from the Labrador Current. The escorts prepared for poor visibility by tightening the perimeter. Just after 2,200 hours, the fog arrived. A sudden wall, a seaman aboard USS Nicholson wrote in his journal. One moment we had a horizon. The next, we were immersed in white. Radar operators tried to maintain spacing, but the troop transports, less maneuverable than destroyers, struggled immediately. Commanders could no longer visually confirm formations. Signal lamps were useless beyond a few dozen yards. Soon, even the rhythmic hum of neighboring ships seemed muted, swallowed by the atmospheric weight of the fog. The troopship SS Humboldt Victory radioed a single, brief message before ordering radio silence restored. Visibility near zero. Reducing speed. Holding heading. Escorts acknowledged the transmission, but within minutes, radar contact became faint, then disappeared altogether. Meanwhile, the destroyers attempted to maintain their grid pattern. On the bridge of HS Wanderer, Lieutenant Harold Coates remarked that the fog appeared to roll with its own tide, drifting against the wind and folding around the ship's superstructure. This wasn't unusual in those waters, but the behavior made station-keeping nearly impossible. USS DuPont reported bearing shifts of over 20 degrees without any course changes, a troubling sign that their radar was being confused by atmospheric interference. At 2,340 hours, confusion escalated. A garbled voice crackled over the emergency frequency, someone aboard Humboldt Victory, struggling to maintain composure, changing course shadows in the fog, adjusting to avoid. The message cut off abruptly. Further attempts to raise the transport were met with static. Whether shadows referred to suspected U-boats, drifting ice, or simple visual distortion remains debated. In heavy fog, shapes could appear and vanish without explanation. Even the mere hint of a threat could cause a captain to alter course, especially when responsible for hundreds of troops. By dawn, the fog had thinned, but the troopship was nowhere in sight. The escorts initiated a wide-area search. USS Nicholson swept southward along the estimated drift line. HMS Wanderer probed the western flank. Aircraft from an anti-submarine patrol squadron operating out of Narsarsuaq joined in, covering hundreds of square miles. At noon, Nicholson recovered a floating wooden crate belonging to Humboldt Victory, but no other debris was found. The lack of wreckage baffled the search teams. A torpedo strike would have left an oil slick. A collision with ice would have scattered splintered timber. Even an onboard mechanical failure should have resulted in rafts or flares. The official report concluded the ship likely strayed far off its assigned heading while avoiding what its captain believed to be a U-boat, or possibly a misidentified echo on the radar, and was then attacked by a submarine operating outside known patrol zones. Yet no German submarine claimed a sinking matching the time and location, and post-war access to German logs provided no clarity. U-boat movements in early July did not align with the disappearance. No intercepted radio messages or decrypted codes mentioned an engagement in that region. Survivor accounts, of course, were non-existent. But the diaries recovered from the ship's last known mail delivery provided one unsettling detail. Several soldiers aboard Humboldt Victory wrote about the fog being too dense even for the Arctic, describing moments where the darkness within the mist felt layered, like curtains drifting past each other. One corporal wrote of hearing a distant horn traveling around us in circles, though no escort ship reported sounding their signal. Modern analysts have proposed several explanations: navigational error compounded by magnetism affecting compasses in the region, radar ghosting caused by atmospheric inversion, or a sudden but localized ice field drifting undetected. Each theory explains part of the event, but not all of it. What remains is a simple, haunting truth: a fully crewed transport ship, carrying over 800 troops and crew, vanished inside a fog bank without leaving a trace. No confirmed wreck, no survivors, no enemy claims. And as the Allies attempted to understand what had gone wrong, the next convoy mystery, one even more baffling, was already forming on the horizon. By late 1943, the Allies had gained a formidable advantage in the North Atlantic. New escort carriers, improved radar, and expanded intelligence networks had started to erode the dominance of the U-boat wolf packs. Yet, despite these advances, the ocean remained a mercurial opponent, one capable of overturning even the most disciplined operations. Convoy on 207, outbound from Liverpool to North America in November 1943, would become a reminder that technology and training could not always overcome the sea's unpredictable hand. And in its wake, it would leave one of the most unsettling mysteries of the later Atlantic campaign: the vanishing and reappearance of an escort corvette under circumstances that contradicted every known naval pattern. On 207 departed on November 2nd, accompanied by Escort Group B4, an experienced formation of British and Canadian warships. Among them sailed the Flower-class corvette HMS Zinnia, a sturdy, dependable vessel known for her resilience in rough seas. The ship's commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Peter Harwood, had weathered numerous convoy battles and rarely expressed concern, but his diary, which would later be recovered, hinted at an unease he could not fully articulate. "Weather shifting quickly," he wrote. "Fog banks forming without pattern. Radar intermittent. Something about this feels unsteady." The convoy proceeded west into worsening conditions. Barometric pressure dropped sharply, and temperature swings hinted at a collision of warm and cold air masses. Meteorologists aboard the escort carrier HMS Spider, supporting distant air cover, warned of irregular mist pockets forming along the convoy's projected track. Escort Group B4 prepared for limited visibility, though no one anticipated what would follow. Shortly after 0200 hours on November 5th, the fog arrived as if hurled onto the sea. Crews described it as thick enough to muffle the engines and gray as poured cement. The visibility collapsed from a few miles to less than 20 yards. Escorts activated battle pattern spacing, using radar to maintain grid formation. But just as the fog reached peak density, several ships reported brief radar blackouts, momentary glitches that caused contacts to vanish, reappear, then vanish again. HMS Zinnia was on the starboard outer screen when the fog hit. At approximately 0258 hours, her radar echo flickered for the last time on the plot boards of HMS Garlize, the group's senior escort. Moments later, Zinnia failed to respond to a routine-coded signal confirming turn adjustments. Multiple attempts to hail her produced silence. Initially, officers assumed she had drifted slightly off position, a common occurrence in poor visibility. But as minutes turned into an hour, and then two, the absence of wreckage, oil, or distress signals became increasingly troubling. The corvette was small, but not so small as to disappear without trace. When the fog lifted at dawn, HMS Garlize initiated a sectional search. Destroyers spread out across the corvette's last reported grid. Aircraft from Biter joined in, sweeping the murky horizon. At 1100 hours, a signalman aboard HMS Forester spotted something through binoculars, a tiny shape drifting on a gentle swell, its silhouette unmistakable. It was HMS Zinnia. But something was wrong. As Forester approached the corvette, crew members noticed her engines were silent and her stern sat lower in the water than normal. Boarding parties found the ship completely abandoned. No crew, no logs, no ration wrappers left on tables. Meals had been prepared but never eaten. The wireless set was switched off. Lifeboats remained secured. And perhaps most perplexing of all, the ship showed no signs of battle damage. Only one detail stood out. The helm was locked hard to port, forcing the ship into a gentle circular drift. Why it had been turned so sharply, and why no one corrected it, remained unclear. In the wheelhouse, Lieutenant Commander Harwood's logbook sat open. His final entry read, "Fog thicker again. Unidentified sounds portside. Could be engines, bearing uncertain." Historians later debated whether he had mistaken distant escort ships for something else in the fog. Sound behaves unpredictably in dense mist. It can bend, reflect, or travel along layers of air in strange ways. A noise from miles away can seem only feet off the bow. But even this quirk of physics did not explain the abandonment. Naval protocol dictated that no captain would order his crew to leave a fully functional ship unless fire, flooding, or imminent danger made evacuation unavoidable. And yet, here was Zinnia, intact, empty, drifting in silence. A later inquiry considered several possibilities. A sudden mechanical failure? Unlikely. Inspections found no such issue. A collision? No hull damage supported that theory. Enemy action? German naval archives contain no references to Zinnia, and U-boat positions did not place any submarine near on 207 at that time. Mutiny or panic? No evidence supported such a radical break in discipline. The Admiralty's final report called the event operationally unresolved, noting only that the disappearance occurred amid abnormal fog density and radar interference. The phrase offered no comfort to the families of the missing crew. Modern researchers have proposed explanations involving rapid carbon monoxide accumulation, rogue waves, or even a faulty depth charge that began to arm prematurely. Each theory has merit, but none align cleanly with the physical state of the ship when found. The truth remains out of reach, tucked somewhere between official records, incomplete logs, and the limits of human perception in extreme conditions. And for the men of Escort Group B4, the abandoned corvette cast a long shadow as the convoy pressed onward. Because as strange as Zinnia's discovery was, the next convoy disappearance would prove even more elusive and would leave almost nothing behind at all. By early 1944, the Allied war machine was accelerating toward its decisive push into Western Europe. The buildup for future operations required a constant, uninterrupted flow of weapons, vehicles, and fuel, supplies that shipped in relentless convoys across the Atlantic. In January, one such formation, Convoy SL 148/MKS 38, drew particular attention from Royal Navy planners. Not because it carried unusual cargo, but because of its route, a narrow corridor off the coast of Ireland where sudden winter fogs were known to smother the sea with little warning. For the sailors assigned to this run, the fog banks were so notorious that they were spoken of almost as if they were living things. It was here that one of the war's quieter maritime puzzles would unfold, involving a freighter that simply vanished between nightfall and dawn. On January 26, 1944, the convoy departed Gibraltar and closed in on the British Isles under thickening cloud cover. Several escort vessels, HMS Exmoor, HMS Penzance, and the Canadian corvette HMCS Chilliwack, formed the screen. The merchant lineup included a mix of British and American freighters carrying ammunition, aviation fuel, rations, and vehicles bound for staging areas across the UK. In the days leading up to the disappearance, weather reports from coastal stations along Ireland's western fringe warned of an unusually dense maritime fog drifting southeast. It was characterized as opaque, rapid-moving, and capable of reducing visibility to near zero. Allied meteorologists struggled to predict its behavior. The Irish Sea and Atlantic fronts were colliding irregularly, creating a patchwork of temperature layers that produced fog pockets with startling speed. For most of January 29th, conditions remained manageable. Light haze, moderate seas, a cold wind from the northwest. But just after 1800 hours, the first tendrils of fog spilled across the convoy. Within an hour, the world had shrunk to a wall of gray. Signal lamps blurred into faint pinpricks. Radar echoes fluctuated, and captains began relying more heavily on compass headings than visual cues. Among the ships struggling with visibility was the British freighter SS Halewell, a mid-sized tramp steamer carrying crated munitions. Her captain, Frederick Marsh, was an experienced sailor who had crossed the Atlantic more than 24 times since the war began. His logs emphasized caution. In one entry recovered earlier in the voyage, he noted, "Fog is enemy enough. One false bearing and a ship may as well be blindfolded." Those words would take on new weight in the hours ahead. At 2,230 hours, the fog thickened into a suffocating curtain. Escorts ordered lights to minimum intensity and instructed ships to reduce speed. The convoy attempted to hold a steady formation, but navigators struggled. Several captains broke radio silence, normally forbidden unless danger threatened, providing conflicting position reports as they tried to maintain cohesion. Some believed they were drifting too far west. Others feared they had overcorrected and were nearing the Irish coast. By midnight, slight panic crept into the escort group. HMS Exmoor received a vague, distorted transmission. "This is Halewell, visibility 0, adjusting vector east." The message cut off. Attempts to re-establish contact met only static. Part of the tension came from a known hazard. German aircraft occasionally patrolled from bases in occupied Norway and France. Those sightings were rare in heavy fog. The threat caused escorts to remain alert. Yet no radar registered aircraft or U-boats. No explosions echoed across the water. Just silence, dense, disorienting, absolute. When the convoy emerged from the fog at dawn, Halewell was missing. The ships closest to her last known position had noticed nothing, no distress flares, no sounds of collision, no shifting shadows. HMS Penzance conducted a search sweep, followed by HMCS Chilliwack, but found nothing. The sea was calm, the weather clearing, and the estimated drift lines produced no debris. What made the disappearance more perplexing was the lack of trace evidence. A ship carrying munitions should not vanish quietly. A torpedo would have caused a blast heard for miles. A collision would have produced floating wreckage, timber, crates, oil. Even if the freighter had run aground, coastal watch stations would have reported the impact. Yet none did. A post-war inquiry in 1948 reviewed German naval archives and confirmed there were no U-boats in operational range of the convoy that night. Luftwaffe logs showed no sorties capable of reaching the area. British coastal radar detected no unidentified contacts. Officially, the Admiralty categorized the loss as foundered in heavy weather, though the weather had not been particularly heavy, only fog-bound. Among historians, theories sprouted. One posits that Halewell strayed far off course and struck a submerged obstacle or a drifting wreck, flooding rapidly before the crew could respond. Another suggests that a cargo hold might have detonated if struck by a floating mine, though no explosion was reported. A third theory involves navigational disorientation. Fog can dull a ship's sense of motion, leading mariners to misjudge speed and heading by significant degrees. Still, none explain why the freighter left no trace. Not a raft, not a crate, not a scrap of canvas. For the surviving crews of SL 148/MKS 38, the memory of Halewell's disappearance lingered long after they made port. Fog could obscure. Fog could scatter. But to erase a fully loaded freighter without a sound was something altogether different. And as the Allies pressed toward the English Channel in 1945, one final convoy mystery, arguably the most haunting of all, would close the chapter on wartime disappearances in fog. By early 1945, the end of the war in Europe was finally within sight. Germany was collapsing on every front, its U-boat arm battered and dwindling, its air power eroded, and its surface fleet largely confined to port. Yet even as the Allies gained dominance of the seas, the English Channel, gateway to liberation and lifeline to the front, remained a place of vigilance. German E-boats still prowled the coastlines at night, laying mines or launching surprise attacks. And nature, as always, could turn the channel into a maze of confusion. It was here, in these final months, that one of the last unsolved convoy disappearances of World War II took place. In March 1945, convoy EMB 17 departed from Plymouth, loaded with ammunition, rations, and engineering equipment destined for the rapidly advancing Allied forces on the continent. Although the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, E-boat strikes remained a real danger, fast, unpredictable, and often emerging from fog banks at the last possible moment. To counter this, the convoy was assigned a small but steady escort of 6 ships, including the destroyers HMS Vivacious, HMS Carysfit, and several motor launches tasked with close defensive sweeps. For the first 2 days, the convoy moved in clear weather. But barometric pressure began dropping sharply on the evening of March 12th, and by midnight, a creeping channel fog began forming across the water. Veteran sailors would later recall the fog's unusual density, too fast, too thick, and too sudden, as one petty officer aboard the Vivacious described it. The channel often birthed these behemoth fog banks in late winter, but this one felt different. It advanced in bands, folding over itself, swallowing sound and shape alike. By 01:30 hours, visibility collapsed to under 50 meters. Commanders ordered reduced speed and tightened escort patterns. Radar teams were instructed to maintain constant sweeps. Yet even the best wartime radar struggled with the channel's temperature inversions, which could scatter returns into misleading ghosts. Within the fog, boats could appear stationary when moving, or invisible until dangerously close. The escort group assigned to EMB 17's western screen, 2 motor launches, and an older Hunt-class escort, began losing reliable contact around this time. Their last report, sent at 0153 hours, was a routine status message. Holding course, fog density increasing. Minutes later, they vanished from radar. At first, the flagship, HMS Carysfit, assumed the western screen had merely drifted out of range. The fog was playing havoc with equipment, and the channel's narrow corridors made navigational drift almost inevitable. But by dawn, when the fog thinned and visibility stretched for several miles, the escorts were still missing. No debris, no oil slick, no distress signal, no survivors. HMS Carysfit immediately initiated a backtrack search, racing west along EMB 17's plotted course. Motorboats from Portsmouth and Plymouth joined the sweep. Coastal radar operators reviewed the night's logs. The RAF dispatched reconnaissance aircraft once visibility improved. The Admiralty braced for the worst, an E-boat ambush, perhaps, or a sudden mine strike. But the evidence did not support either. German E-boats from Cherbourg and Dutch bases were grounded by fuel shortages in mid-March and had not sailed. Kriegsmarine radio intercepts, decrypted days later, mention no operations in the area. No mines were recorded within EMB 17's assigned corridor. And no German naval records, captured at war's end, referenced any engagement that night. The closest thing to a clue came from a coastal observer stationed near Start Point, who reported hearing faint engines accelerating rapidly, then fading, around 0200 hours, yet no ship, allied or enemy, logged movements or speed changes at that moment. Fog, of course, can twist sound into illusions. But the report added another layer to an already perplexing event. Multiple post-war analyses attempted to explain the disappearance. One theory suggests a navigational chain reaction. The lead escort may have overcorrected to avoid a phantom radar contact, perhaps a temperature inversion or echo off the fog itself, drawing the other two ships off course into uncharted hazards or mine remnants. Another theory proposes a collision in near-zero visibility, followed by a rapid sinking in deep water. Yet motor launches typically carried rafts and flotation gear that should have surfaced. Still, no trace was ever recovered. The channel, dense with wartime wrecks, shifting currents, and silted seabeds, has swallowed countless vessels over the centuries. But the loss of 3 escorts in a single night, without a single distress flare or a scrap of evidence, remains one of its strangest wartime anomalies. For naval historians, the disappearance of the EMB 17 Western Screen symbolizes the final chaos of the Maritime War, a reminder that even as Germany faltered, the sea retained its mastery over life, death, and uncertainty. Fog, once again, had served as the perfect accomplice, masking signals, distorting bearings, and blurring the line between enemy threat and environmental hazard. And as the guns fell silent later that year, families of the lost escorts were left without closure, only a line in the Admiralty's official report, "Destroyed by enemy action, probable." A phrase chosen more for administrative neatness than certainty. In truth, the conditions of that night remain as obscure as the fog that swallowed those ships. And with the passing of the war's last witnesses, the mystery of Convoy EMB 17's vanished escorts has settled into the cold depths of the Channel, one final reminder of how the sea, even in the war's dying months, could still rewrite the rules without leaving a trace.